In the last video, we talked about the first invasion of the Peloponnesus, and of course that was in the year 370 BC. In the following year, in 369 BC, there was a second invasion of the Peloponnesus. And in that year, the Argives and the Arcadians were once again eager to launch yet another campaign against Sparta. They had Sparta on the ropes, and they were intent on finishing them off. And so they requested the Thebans for assistance. Epaminondas was once again tasked to lead the expedition. Meanwhile, the Athenians, Corinthians, and Spartans were determined not to remain idle. A combined force marched to Corinth to seize key passes in the isthmus. That, of course, is the Isthmus of Corinth. And this, of course, was an attempt to block the Thebans from making a descent into the Peloponnesus. The Thebans first camped in the flat plain below the main pass the Spartans and Athenians were blocking. Epaminondas made the decision to advance against the most vulnerable spot in the pass, which, not coincidentally, was held by the Spartans. Epaminondas launched an attack at dawn that caught the Spartans completely by surprise. The attack was timed to take advantage of the Spartan changing of the guard. As a result, the Spartans were thrown into complete disarray. Eventually, the Spartans were able to regroup higher up the pass. A truce was finally reached, which, according to Xenophon, favored the Thebans more than it did the Spartans. This was made apparent as the Thebans were now free to descend down to the other side of the mountain, which they wasted no time doing. In this manner, the Thebans were able to cross the Isthmus of Corinth and soon linked up with the Arcadians and Argives. The Thebans and their allies soon advanced against cities allied to Sparta, but mainly the Thebans ravaged the surrounding countryside. The Thebans finally arrived at Corinth, hoping to find the city gate open. However, the Corinthians were ready and with a body of light troops attacked the Theban task force. The Thebans were pushed back from Corinth. The Corinthians, quote, dragged the corpses of the slain to the wall and finally gave them up under a flag of truce, erecting a trophy to record the victory. As a result of this occurrence, the allies of Sparta took fresh heart, end quote. After this setback at Corinth, the Theban army once again laid waste to the countryside, destroying everything and anything in their path. The Athenian and Corinthian cavalry maintained a safe distance since they were outnumbered severely by the much larger Theban army. As winter approached, the Thebans headed home, and this brought an end to what was rather an inconclusive campaign in 369 BC. In the following year, in 368 BC, Epaminondas was yet again brought up on charges by his political enemies. This time, however, the opposition succeeded, and amazingly, Epaminondas was removed from command. Meanwhile, in the Peloponnesus, some of Thebes' allies began to have ideas of their own. The Arcadians were pushed by a man named Lycomedes. It had been Lycomedes who had helped form the Arcadian League, so he was universally revered by nearly all of the Arcadian cities. He reminded the Arcadians that they were Peloponnesians first and foremost, and that it was the Arcadians who possessed some of the finest warriors in Greece. He also reminded his audience that it was the Arcadians who had fought side by side with the Spartans many times in battle, and therefore it was the Arcadians who had helped transform Sparta into a major power. And so Lycomedes was convinced that if the Arcadians remained under Theban control, they would assist Thebes in becoming a, quote, second edition of Sparta, end quote. And so, not surprisingly, the Arcadians launched their own attacks without consulting Thebes. The Arcadians first boldly rescued the Argives, who were under assault from the Athenians and Corinthians. Next, they marched into Messenia and advanced against the Spartan garrison at Asini. There, they killed the Spartan in command and also sacked the city. These exploits, according to Xenophon, soured the relationship between Thebes and Arcadia. Meanwhile, Thessaly and Thebes came into conflict. The Theban army marched into Thessaly to rescue Pelopidas, who had been imprisoned by Thessaly while serving as an ambassador. This distraction in Thessaly essentially prevented the Thebans from launching further attacks deeper into the Peloponnesus, at least for the short term. It was around this time that another attempt was made at securing a long-term peace. I almost find that sort of a joke in ancient Greece, but anyways, they decided to go ahead and meet up at Delphi. Interestingly enough, it was the Persians who attempted to mediate the dispute, but it failed when the Thebans rejected the Spartans' demand that Messenia once again be subject to Sparta. After the negotiations failed, the Persian emissary decided to provide further funding to Sparta. Sparta would then use this money to hire more mercenaries. Meanwhile, Syracuse had dispatched reinforcements to assist Sparta. Athens and Sparta debated about what to do with the extra reinforcements once they arrived. The Athenians wanted to send the reinforcements to assist Thessaly, while the Spartans wanted to keep the reinforcements in Laconia, due to the ever-present danger posed by the reinvigorated Arcadians. Eventually, the decision was made to send the reinforcements to Laconia, where a combined force of Syracusans and Spartans was created. The task force was led by Archidamus, who advanced into southern Arcadia. Archidamus captured Carrhae and put all of the citizens to the sword. Soon Archidamus was in sight of the Arcadian army that had been dispatched to stop him. Xenophon states that the sky suddenly turned dark with lightning and thunder. This was seen as a good omen, and the decision was made to meet the Arcadians head-on. Boosting their spirits was a nearby statue of Hercules. With their morale boosted, Archidamus's men eagerly pushed forward to meet the Arcadians in battle, and easily routed the Arcadians. There was jubilation in Sparta, even more so that not one single Spartan had died in the engagement. According to Xenophon, even the Thebans were pleased at the result, because the Thebans, after all, had been angry at the Arcadians for going solo, and this served as a painful lesson to all of her allies, that Thebes should run the overall war campaign. In the following year, in 367 BC, the Thebans were anxious to reassert control over her allies in the Peloponnesus. The fear was that if the Thebans lost influence, this would allow the Spartans to rebuild the Peloponnesian League. It was absolutely vital to remain in control of Arcadia and Messenia. This was part of the two-pronged approach Thebes wanted to use to keep the Spartans bottled up in the Peloponnesus. Epaminondas wanted to deal with the Achaeans first, and therefore decided to march a Theban army right into Achaea. The ploy worked rather easily, and Achaea submitted to the Thebans, and with that the Thebans marched back into Boeotia. But it was a strange alliance indeed, because Epaminondas had secured the alliance from Achaean oligarchs, who were naturally friendly to Sparta. The Arcadians said, quote, Epaminondas had merely swept and garnished Achaea for the Spartans, and then gone off, end quote. Epaminondas' enemies in Thebes decided to send governors to Achaea to drive out the oligarchs and establish democracy throughout Achaea. After all, Thebes was a democracy itself. The democratic governments that were installed, however, did not last long, as the oligarchs reorganized and took back city after city in Achaea. And not surprisingly, they pledged loyalty to Sparta first and foremost. In the following year, in 366 BC, a curious incident happened that enraged Athens to the point that there was a real risk of a full-blown border war with Thebes. The town of Eurupus had for centuries been a source of dispute between Thebes and Athens. It hit ahead in 366 when Themiston, who was the tyrant of Euboea, seized the town. Eurupus was a vital economic center for Athens, and so not surprisingly, Athens dispatched a sizable force to take back Eurupus. Rather than fight the Athenians, Themiston simply ceded the town to the Thebans. Now, if the Athenians wanted to take the city back, they risked a full-blown war with the Thebans. Athens appealed to several Peloponnesian cities for help, but found few takers, except for Arcadia. It was Lycomedes who persuaded the Arcadians to hold discussions with the Athenians on a potential alliance. This was a very bizarre turn of events, since Arcadia was a bitter enemy of the Spartans. But the Athenians decided to form an alliance, especially since this would weaken Thebes. Times were indeed becoming very strange in ancient Greece. Athens was now friend to both Sparta and Arcadia. And as we know, the Arcadians and Spartans were bitter enemies. Of course, the Athenian foreign policy was completely directed against Thebes. By the way, Lycomedes, who had pushed for this alliance in the first place, was assassinated, but still the alliance between Arcadia and Athens continued on. After the peace negotiations were concluded, the Athenians desired to control the isthmus to the Peloponnesus, especially since their two most important allies were Sparta and now Arcadia. On the surface, they decided to reinforce Corinth with garrisons. In reality, it was more of a plan to seize Corinth itself. The Corinthians, however, saw right through this and viewed this as a semi-hostile act, and refused to admit the Athenian navy into their harbor. In addition, the Athenians that were already guarding the isthmus were expelled from Corinthian territory. Still, the Corinthians had reason to worry about possible Athenian aggression, especially since the Athenians had numerous allies in the Peloponnesus. This was, of course, not the powerful Corinth of old. Both their navy and land army had been greatly diminished after the Peloponnesian War. Thebes decided to take advantage of Corinth's security concerns and sought an alliance. The Corinthians decided to conclude a peace treaty with Thebes, which apparently was done with the blessing of Sparta. However, they did not conclude a military alliance with Thebes, which undoubtedly would have incurred the wrath of Sparta and perhaps Arcadia. Soon there was yet another attempt to make a common peace, with the Persians once again acting as arbitrator. Thebes pushed forward their own peace offers, but all of their attempts failed. By now, other Greek cities resented the growing influence of Thebes, and so the fighting remorselessly continued on. By 362 BC, several city-states around Greece had become openly hostile to the Thebans, most notably the Mantineans. They were convinced that the Thebans were intent on utterly destroying the Peloponnesus. They sought to create a new alliance against Thebes and dispatched emissaries to both Sparta and Athens. Epaminondas wasn't about to let that happen, and sought another invasion of the Peloponnesus, with the primary goal of attacking Mantinea. This would be an army primarily composed of Boeotians, with the Euboeans and some Thessalians. By now, Epaminondas could only count on the support of Argos and the Messenians. The Messenians remained a staunch ally of Thebes throughout these turbulent years. The Arcadian League itself was deeply divided about who to support. Tegea and Megalopolis decided to side with Thebes, while Mantinea formed an alliance with Sparta and Athens. Once again, you can see how confusing this situation became in ancient Greece. Now, after the Thebans entered the Peloponnesus, Epaminondas established his base at Tegea. This would serve as the central repository for all the forces loyal to Thebes. Meanwhile, the Spartan army marched to Mantinea. This set the stage for one of the largest Greek battles ever fought up to that point, with perhaps as many as 60,000 troops involved. There was not a single city-state in Greece that was not involved with this battle. Now, the Mantineans occupied the position of honor on the far right, with the Arcadians and Spartans right next to them. The Eleans and Achaeans occupied the center, with the Athenians holding the left flank. On the other side, Epaminondas employed some of the same tactics he used at Leuctra, and deployed a 50-deep block on the left. The Tegeans and Argives occupied the center, with other allies occupying the far right. Both sides maintained cavalry to protect the wings of their formations. During the course of the battle, the Mantinean cavalry was pushed back by the Theban and Thessalian cavalry, while on the other side of the formation, the Athenian cavalry was routed by the Theban cavalry. The Theban phalanx then crashed into the Spartan left flank, and with the assistance of their victorious cavalry, broke it. But the Theban victory was short-lived, because in a cruel twist of fate, Epaminondas was cut down, and the pursuit was quickly called off. Epaminondas was hit in the chest by a spear. It has been suggested that the Spartans were deliberately aiming at Epaminondas in the hope of killing him. After Epaminondas collapsed, there was a bitter struggle between the Thebans and Spartans for his body, but eventually the Thebans were able to recover his body. While he was carried off, Epaminondas asked his countrymen who had won the battle. When informed that the Thebans had won, Epaminondas stated simply, "It's time to die." Many ancient historians considered Epaminondas to be one of the greatest generals and statesmen in ancient Greece. He was considered to be incorruptible, and of course was unmatched on the battlefield during his day. And so this closes out Xenophon's account. Here are the last lines he wrote in the aftermath of the Battle of Mantinea. Uncertainty and confusion indeed had gained ground, being tenfold greater throughout the length and breadth of Hellas after the battle than before. You sense Xenophon's frustration here? I think he was apathetic to the madness of it all. After all, what did all of these battles and wars accomplish in the end? Not much, except to permanently weaken Sparta and Thebes. Athens, however, had regained much of its former empire, and took total control of the sea. And Athens was also bringing in those all-important tributes again. So Athens looked set to perhaps reestablish her empire to all of its former glory. Except there was this little problem in the north that soon became a very big problem, and we will get to that in the next video.